The garage door was already halfway open when I heard my son-in-law Brad's voice cut through the morning air like a knife through butter, honey, and let me tell you, those words hit me harder than a freight train on the tracks outside Cheyenne. "Don't look in the garage, Mom," he said, but sweetie, it was too late because I was already staring at the empty concrete where my beautiful 2019 Honda Civic used to sit, the one I'd worked double shifts at the Target pharmacy for 4 years to pay off completely, and my heart just dropped straight through the floor of that garage in Laramie, Wyoming. Y'all, I'm Ruth, and at 73 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal this world had to offer after raising 3 kids as a single mother and working as a librarian for 37 years, but standing there in my own driveway at 6:45 in the morning, still in my lavender, floral house coat and fuzzy pink slippers that my granddaughter Emma had given me for Christmas, staring at that empty space where my independence used to park every single night for the past 5 years, I realized I hadn't seen nothing yet, honey. Absolutely nothing at all. The concrete still had those 4 perfect tire marks, like ghost prints of everything I had lost, darker patches where the Wyoming snow and ice had been kept away by my reliable little car. And I could feel my voice starting to crack like old paint on a barn door when I whispered through the mountain morning air, "Brad, where in God's green earth is my car?" My breath came out in little white puffs because October mornings in Wyoming are colder than a well digger's backside, and I pulled my housecoat tighter around my shoulders while my mind tried to process what my eyes were telling me. My son-in-law, this 41-year-old man who'd been living in my house for the past 11 months since he lost his job at the coal mine outside Gillette, had the absolute audacity to look me straight in the eye and shrug his shoulders like he was discussing whether we might get snow later in the week. "Oh, that old thing? We sold it, Mom. You don't need to be driving anymore anyway, especially with winter coming and all these icy roads around here." The way he said "old thing" about my car, honey, my voice broke right in half because that Honda wasn't just transportation. It was my freedom, my dignity, my way to get to my weekly book club at the library on Tuesday afternoons and my monthly trips to see my older sister Mildred down in Fort Collins, Colorado. Now let me tell you something about my car, sweetie, because this wasn't just any old vehicle. That 2019 Honda Civic LX in metallic blue was the first car I'd ever bought brand new in my entire 73 years on this earth. Every other car I'd owned had been used, handed down, or bought from some neighbor who needed quick cash. But when I retired from the Laramie County Library system with my pension intact and my savings finally healthy, I walked into Fremont Honda on Grand Avenue and said, "I want something reliable that'll last me the rest of my driving years." The salesman, a nice young man named Jake who reminded me of my youngest son when he was that age, showed me that beautiful Honda. And honey, when I sat behind that wheel for the first time, I felt like I was driving into a whole new chapter of my life. Before I tell you what happened next, and sweetie, this part is going to absolutely shock you because what they done was so much worse than just selling my car. If you're loving this story, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. You know I get so excited when I see y'all in the comments. Speaking of which, what state are you calling home right now? Drop it down below and tell me honestly, have you ever had family treat you like you didn't matter? Because your stories help me know I'm not alone in this crazy world. And honey, some of the messages y'all send just warm my heart like hot chocolate on a cold Wyoming morning. Now, let me tell you what I discovered next, because what they done was about to backfire in the most beautiful way you can imagine. I heard myself ask, and y'all could hear the disbelief just dripping from every single letter like honey off a warm biscuit. Who exactly is we, Bradley Michael Thompson? I used his full name because that's what you do when you're about to lose your ever-loving mind. And I watched his face change from cocky to uncomfortable faster than you could say Grand Theft Auto. His jaw tightened up like he was chewing on something sour, and he looked over my shoulder toward the house like he was hoping for backup to come walking out that front door. That's when my daughter Jennifer came stumbling out of the house, still in her purple pajamas with little teddy bears all over them, with that guilty look I remembered when she was 17, and I caught her sneaking back into the house at 3 in the morning after the homecoming dance. "Mom, we can explain," Jennifer started, but honey, I held up my hand because suddenly everything was becoming crystal clear, like when the fog lifts off the snowy range on a summer morning. "The title," I said, my voice getting stronger with every word, each syllable cutting through the cold morning air like a sword through silk. "Y'all forged my signature on the title, didn't you?" The silence that stretched between us was longer than the line at the Walmart on Black Friday. And in that silence, I could hear my whole world crashing down around me like a house of cards in a Wyoming windstorm. A meadowlark called from somewhere across the street, that sweet morning song that usually made me smile. But right then, it sounded like a funeral dirge for my stolen independence. I could see Mrs. Patterson next door peeking through her kitchen curtains, probably wondering why the Peterson family was having what looked like a serious discussion in their driveway before 7 in the morning. Brad cleared his throat and had the nerve to sound annoyed, like I was inconveniencing him by asking about my stolen car. "Look, Mom, you're getting up there in age, and honestly, your reflexes aren't what they used to be. We saw you almost slide through that intersection during the snowstorm last month, and we figured it was time to make the hard decision for you before something terrible happened." Y'all, I let out the longest breath you ever heard because that intersection incident happened during the worst snow blizzard we'd had in 5 years, when even the snowplows were having trouble staying on the road. But apparently that gave them all the justification they needed to steal my independence and sell it for cash. "Where's the money?" I asked, and my voice took on this knowing, suspicious quality because, honey, I didn't raise no fool during my 37 years working with teenagers at the library. I'd seen every kind of lie, excuse, and half-truth that young people could come up with, and my own daughter was stammering worse than Jimmy Morrison trying to explain why he hadn't returned his overdue books for the 3rd time in a month. We used it for house expenses, Mom. You know, groceries, utilities, heating bills, stuff like that." Jennifer's voice got smaller with each word, like she was shrinking inside herself, and she couldn't meet my eyes when she said it. That's when something inside me snapped like a rubber band that's been stretched too far for too long. House expenses? I could feel those tears starting to sting my eyes, but they weren't sad tears, honey. They were pure rage tears mixed with disbelief and heartbreak. This is my house with my name on the deed that I worked 40 years to pay off while raising you kids by myself after your father decided he'd rather chase barmaids in Casper than be a husband and father, and you sold my car to pay for expenses in my house? The words came out between little sobs, but each sob was building into something bigger, something angrier, something these two had never seen from their sweet old mom, Ruth. Jennifer tried to put her arm around me, but I stepped back because suddenly I didn't want their comfort. I wanted answers. I wanted justice, and I wanted my car back. "Mom, please understand, we're struggling right now. Brad's been looking for work ever since the mine laid him off, and you thought you'd steal from me," I interrupted, and honey, my voice was dripping with all that irony you could taste. "You thought you'd take the one thing that let me maintain some dignity and independence, and you thought I'd just smile and take it like some senile old lady who doesn't know better?" Now, let me back up and tell you how we got to this point, because this story goes deeper than a Wyoming oil well, and the roots of this betrayal stretch back further than you might think. Jennifer is my middle child, 45 years old, and she's always been the one who struggled the most with life's challenges. Her older brother Michael is a successful engineer up in Billings, and her younger sister Sarah teaches school down in Denver. But Jennifer, bless her heart, has always seemed to find trouble like a magnet finds metal. She dropped out of college after 2 years, worked a series of retail jobs that never seemed to last more than a year or two, and had a string of relationships with men who treated her poorly. When she met Brad 5 years ago at a honky-tonk bar in Cheyenne, I thought maybe she'd finally found someone who would treat her right. He seemed steady enough, worked at the mine, had his own apartment, and he was polite to me during family gatherings. But honey, people can fool you for a long time if they're determined enough. And Brad Thompson turned out to be one of those men who's charming on the surface, but rotten underneath, like an apple that looks perfect until you bite into it and find it's brown at the core. The trouble started about 18 months ago when Brad began having problems at work. He'd come home complaining about his supervisor, about safety regulations being too strict, about how the mine owners didn't appreciate good workers anymore. At first, I felt sorry for him because Lord knows working in a coal mine isn't easy, and I tried to be supportive when he vented his frustrations over dinner at my kitchen table. But gradually, his complaints became more frequent and more bitter, and I started noticing that he was drinking more beer than usual while telling these stories. Then came the first layoff notice last winter. The mine was cutting back due to decreased demand for coal, and Brad was one of the newer employees, so his name was on the list. Jennifer was beside herself with worry about how they were going to pay their bills. And that's when I made the first of what would turn out to be several mistakes. "Why don't you two move in here temporarily?" I suggested one snowy evening in February, "just until Brad finds another job. This house is too big for just me anyway, and it would help both of us." Y'all, looking back on it now, I can see that this was when they started seeing me not as Jennifer's mother who deserved respect, but as their personal ATM machine. It started small, like most thefts do. Brad would ask to borrow $20 for gas, promising to pay me back on Friday, but Friday would come and go without any mention of the money. Jennifer would ask if I could pick up groceries for all of us since I was going to the store anyway, but somehow they never offered to pay their share of the bill. By summer, they'd established a pattern of treating my home like their personal resort. Brad would sleep until 10 or 11 in the morning, spend the afternoon playing video games in what used to be my sewing room, and then complain if I wanted to watch my evening programs on the television that I'd paid for with my own money. Jennifer would leave dishes in the sink for days, expecting me to clean up after her like she was still a teenager, and both of them acted like I was being unreasonable when I asked them to help with basic household chores. But the real warning signs started appearing in August, when I noticed Brad making a lot of phone calls in the garage, always stepping outside when his phone rang, speaking in low voices like he was conducting some kind of secret business. When I asked Jennifer about it, she just shrugged and said he was probably talking to potential employers. But honey, something about those conversations didn't sit right with me. There was something furtive about the way he'd glance around before answering his phone, something guilty about how quickly he'd end the calls when I came outside to tend my tomato plants. That evening, after they'd gone inside to let me cool off, I sat on my front porch swing, the same swing my late husband David had hung 28 years ago before the cancer took him, and I started thinking about all the little things that should have warned me this was coming. Y'all, when you're 73 and you've been pushed around by your own family, you've got two choices. You can roll over and accept it like a beaten dog, or you can get mad and get even. I could feel this little smile creeping into my voice as I talked to myself out there in the Wyoming twilight, because I was about to show these two exactly who they were messing with. You see, honey, what Brad and Jennifer didn't know was that their sweet old mom Ruth hadn't just worked at the library for 37 years. I'd been the head librarian for the last 15 of those years, and that job taught me how to research, how to investigate, and how to document everything. When you're dealing with a budget of $2 million and a staff of 23, you learn to pay attention to details, to follow paper trails, and to spot inconsistencies in stories. Those skills don't just disappear when you retire, sweetie. They get stronger with experience.
The next morning, while Brad was out job hunting, which I suspected meant playing poker at Mickey's Tavern with his unemployed buddies, and Jennifer was at her part-time job at the Ace Hardware store, I walked my 73-year-old self right down to the First Security Bank of Laramie, where I'd been banking since I moved to Wyoming in 1978. Y'all, when I walked through those glass doors wearing my best navy blue dress and carrying my old leather purse that David had given me for our 10th anniversary, every single employee in that bank knew I meant business. "Mrs. Peterson, what can we do for you today?" asked Amanda, the customer service representative who'd been helping me for the past 8 years. She's a sweet girl, about 35, with 2 kids in elementary school, and she'd always been respectful and helpful when I came in with questions about my accounts. But today, I wasn't coming in with questions. I was coming in with demands. "Amanda, honey, I need to speak with Mr. Davidson right away," I said, referring to the branch manager. "I have reason to believe that someone has been accessing my accounts without my permission, and I need to see every single transaction that's been made in the past 6 months. Amanda's eyes got wide as silver dollars, and she picked up her phone faster than a prairie dog diving into his burrow when it spots a hawk. 5 minutes later, I was sitting in Mr. Davidson's office, the same office where I had signed the papers for my mortgage refinancing 3 years earlier. Robert Davidson was a distinguished gentleman in his early 50s, always impeccably dressed, and he'd been managing this branch for over a decade. He knew every long-term customer by name, and he took his responsibility to protect our assets very seriously. "Mrs. Peterson, Amanda says you're concerned about unauthorized access to your accounts. Can you tell me what's prompted this concern?" His voice was professional but warm, the voice of someone who'd handled these situations before and knew they required both efficiency and sensitivity. I straightened my shoulders and looked him directly in the eye, the way I used to look at difficult teenagers who thought they could lie to the head librarian. "Robert, I need you to pull up my accounts and show me every transaction that's been made since my daughter and son-in-law moved into my house. I believe they may have been stealing from me, and I need to know the extent of what they've done." My voice was steady and clear, but inside, my heart was hammering like a woodpecker on a hollow tree because I was terrified of what we might find. Robert's fingers started flying over his keyboard, and honey, watching those numbers and dates appearing on his computer screen was like watching my worst fears come to life in real time. "Mrs. Peterson, I see here that you signed a limited power of attorney form last March, giving your daughter, Jennifer, access to your checking account for the purpose of helping you manage your bills while you recovered from your knee surgery." I remembered that surgery, a minor arthroscopic procedure that had me off my feet for about 2 weeks. Jennifer had been so helpful during my recovery, bringing me meals, running errands, and offering to handle my monthly bills so I wouldn't have to worry about them while I was healing. At the time, it seemed like such a thoughtful gesture from a loving daughter, but now I was beginning to see it for what it really was, the first step in a carefully planned scheme to gain access to my money. "Robert," I said, "I want to see every single transaction they've made since then," and my voice had taken on that librarian tone that brooks no argument. He started printing out page after page of statements, and with each page that came out of that printer, my heart sank a little deeper. $300 here for utilities, $200 there for groceries, $50 there for gas, and withdrawal after withdrawal after withdrawal, each one chipping away at the retirement savings I'd worked 40 decades to accumulate. But that wasn't even the worst part, sweetie. The worst part came when Robert showed me the credit card applications that had been submitted in my name. "Mrs. Peterson, according to our records, you applied for 3 new credit cards in the past 4 months. The Visa card with a $15,000 limit, the MasterCard with a $10,000 limit, and the Discover card with a $5,000 limit. All 3 cards have been maxed out, and the bills are being sent to your home address." Y'all, I could barely whisper those words when the full scope of what they'd done hit me like a Wyoming blizzard. Not only had they been stealing my monthly Social Security and pension payments, but they destroyed my credit rating by opening accounts in my name and running up debt that I'd take me years to pay off. "Robert," I said, my voice shaking like an aspen tree in a strong wind, I never applied for any credit cards. I haven't needed credit in over 10 years because I pay cash for everything I buy." That's when Robert's expression changed from professional concern to genuine alarm. "Mrs. Peterson, what you're describing is identity theft and elder financial abuse. These are serious federal crimes, and we need to report this to the authorities immediately." He picked up his phone and started dialing, and honey, hearing him say words like federal crimes and authorities made this whole nightmare suddenly feel real in a way it hadn't before. While Robert was on the phone with what sounded like the bank security department, I sat there in that leather chair, staring at pages after pages of transactions that represented months of systematic theft. Each withdrawal, each forged signature, each fraudulent credit application was a betrayal that cut deeper than the last. These weren't strangers who had stolen my identity. These were the people I'd invited into my home, the people I'd cooked for and cleaned up after and worried about when they were struggling. "Mrs. Peterson," Robert said, after hanging up the phone, "I've contacted our fraud department, and they're going to freeze all of your accounts immediately to prevent any further unauthorized access. They're also going to reverse all charges that can be proven fraudulent, but you're going to need to file police reports and probably consult with an attorney who specializes in elder abuse cases." 20 minutes later, I walked out of that bank with a folder full of evidence that made my head spin like a dust devil in a Wyoming wheat field. Not only had they stolen over $12,000 from my checking and savings accounts, but the credit card debt they'd accumulated in my name totaled another $30,000. Y'all, I'd gone from being a financially secure retiree to someone facing potential bankruptcy, all because I trusted my own daughter and the man she'd chosen to marry.
But honey, that was just the beginning of what I was about to discover. Because Dorothy Peterson didn't spend 37 years as a librarian without learning how to dig deeper when something didn't add up. I spent the rest of that afternoon at the Albany County Library, using their computers and internet access to research everything I could find about identity theft, elder abuse, and financial fraud. The librarian on duty, a young woman named Cassie who'd been one of my part-time employees before I retired, was happy to help me navigate the legal websites and print out articles about my rights as a victim of financial abuse. What I learned during those 3 hours of research made me realize that what Brad and Jennifer had done to me wasn't just wrong, it was part of a pattern of elder abuse that affects hundreds of thousands of older Americans every year. According to the National Council on Aging, financial abuse of elderly people results in losses of over $36 billion annually, and in 60% of cases, the perpetrator is a family member who has gained the victim's trust. Reading those statistics, honey, I felt a mixture of comfort and rage. Comfort because I realized I wasn't alone, that other people had survived similar betrayals and found ways to fight back. Rage because I understood that Brad and Jennifer had deliberately targeted me, not despite the fact that I was their family, but because of it. They'd counted on my love for Jennifer and my desire to help them during a difficult time, and they turned those natural emotions into weapons to use against me. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with all the evidence spread out in front of me like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that revealed an ugly picture. Bank statements, credit card applications, board signatures, and printed articles about elder abuse covered every inch of that old oak table where I'd helped Jennifer with her homework 25 years earlier. Y'all, the irony wasn't lost on me that I was planning to turn in my own daughter at the same table where I'd once helped her learn to write her name. When Jennifer and Brad came home from their respective jobs that evening, they found me sitting at that table with all the evidence organized into neat piles, each one labeled with a sticky note describing the type of fraud it represented. The looks on their faces when they saw what I'd discovered were worth more than all the money they'd stolen. Because for the first time in months, I saw fear in their eyes instead of that smug confidence they'd been wearing like cheap cologne. "Mom, what's all this?" Jennifer asked, but her voice was small and shaky, like she already knew exactly what it was and what it meant for their future.
Brad stood behind her, and I could see his mind working, probably trying to figure out if there was still some way to talk their way out of this or if it was time to start thinking about running. "Now hold on there, Mom," he said, using that condescending tone that suggested I was too old and confused to understand what I was talking about. "I think you're blowing this all out of proportion. We were just trying to help you manage your finances, and maybe we made some mistakes, but calling it crime is a little extreme, don't you think?" That's when I stood up from my chair, all 5 feet and 4 inches of me, and looked that man directly in the eye with all the authority I'd developed during 3 decades of dealing with troublemakers who thought they could intimidate the head librarian. "Bradley Thompson, the only mistake here was me trusting you and my daughter with access to my accounts. What you've done isn't helping, it's stealing, and it's going to land both of you in federal prison if I have anything to say about it." Jennifer started crying then, not the manipulative tears I'd seen her use to get out of trouble when she was younger, but real tears of fear and regret. "Mom, please, I'm so sorry. We never meant for it to go this far. It started with just a little money here and there when we were really desperate, and then it just kept getting worse. We were going to pay you back. I swear we were." "Pay me back with what money, Jennifer?" I asked, and honey, my voice was as cold as a January morning in Jackson Hole. "You've been unemployed except for part-time work for over a year. Brad hasn't had a steady job since the mine layoffs, and you've both been living in my house, eating my food, and using my utilities without contributing a dime. Where exactly was this payback money going to come from?" That's when Brad made his biggest mistake of the evening. Instead of showing remorse or trying to apologize, he got angry. And when Brad got angry, his true colors showed brighter than a neon sign in Vegas. "Now, you know what, old lady? You should be grateful we've been here taking care of you. You're getting senile, you can't drive safely anymore, and you need someone to make sure you don't hurt yourself or other people. We were doing you a favor by selling that car, and if you can't see that, then maybe it's time we found you a nice nursing home where they can keep an eye on you properly." Y'all, if Brad thought that threat was going to intimidate me, he was about as wrong as a compass in a lightning storm. Those words hit me like a slap in the face, but instead of hurting me, they filled me with a rage so pure and focused that I felt like I could move mountains with my bare hands. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous like thunder rolling across the prairie before a tornado. "Get out of my house right now, both of you, and don't you dare come back." "Mom, please," Jennifer tried to protest, but I held my hand to stop her because I was done listening to excuses and promises and lies. "You have exactly 1 hour to pack your belongings and leave my property," I continued, my voice getting stronger with every word. "And Jennifer, honey, you stopped being my daughter the moment you decided to steal from me and threaten me with a nursing home. Don't you ever forget that." For the next hour, I sat in my living room and listened to them packing their things, slamming drawers and closet doors, arguing in whispers about whose fault this was and what they were going to do now. Y'all, I won't lie and say it didn't hurt to hear my own daughter talking about me like I was the problem, but it also confirmed that I was doing the right thing by standing up for myself. At 8:57, they carried their suitcases and garbage bags full of belongings out to Brad's pickup truck. And honey, watching them load up their sad collection of possessions was like watching the end of a chapter in my life that I was ready to close forever. Jennifer tried one more time to talk to me, standing at my front door with tears streaming down her face, but I looked right through her like she was a stranger, because that's exactly what she'd become to me. "Mom, please don't do this. We're family. We can work this out." Her voice was desperate now, pleading in a way I'd never heard before, but it was too little, too late for apologies and promises. "Family doesn't steal from family, Jennifer," I said, my voice as final as a judge's gavel. "Family doesn't threaten nursing homes when they get caught stealing. Family doesn't forge signatures and destroy credit ratings and sell cars without permission. You made your choice when you decided I was easier to rob than to respect." After they drove away, I sat in my quiet house for the first time in 11 months, and honey, the silence was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in almost a year. No video games blaring from the sewing room, no arguments about what to watch on television, no dirty dishes appearing in my sink every morning like magic. Just peaceful, dignified quiet that reminded me what it felt like to live in my own home instead of feeling like a guest in a boarding house. The next morning, I got dressed in my best navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to retirement parties and important library board meetings, and I drove my borrowed neighbor's car to the Albany County Sheriff's Department. Mrs. Patterson next door had been happy to lend me her old Toyota after I explained what had happened, and she'd hugged me tight and told me how proud she was that I was standing up for myself. Detective Maria Gonzalez was the officer assigned to my case, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who specialized in financial crimes against elderly victims. Y'all, from the moment I sat down in her office and started laying out my evidence, I could tell she'd seen this story before, but that didn't make her any less thorough in documenting every detail of what had been done to me. Mrs. Peterson, I want you to know that what happened to you is unfortunately very common. But the fact that you've documented everything so thoroughly is going to make this case much easier to prosecute, Detective Gonzalez said as she photographed each piece of evidence and made notes in her report. Most victims of elder financial abuse don't realize what's happening until it's too late to gather this kind of proof. For the next 2 hours, we went through every bank statement, every forged signature, every fraudulent credit card application, and every piece of evidence I'd collected. Detective Gonzalez explained that the case would be referred to both the FBI and the State Attorney General's office because the crimes involved identity theft and fraud across state lines, which made them federal offenses as well as state crimes. What kind of punishment are we talking about here? I asked, because, honey, I wanted to know that justice was going to be more than just a slap on the wrist and a promise to do better. Elder financial abuse in Wyoming carries a penalty of up to 10 years in prison and a $50,000 fine. Identity theft is a federal crime that can add another 5 to 15 years, depending on the amount of money involved. And if we can prove that this was part of a larger pattern of elder abuse, which it sounds like it was, the sentences can be even longer. Y'all, hearing those numbers should have made me feel better, but instead they made me feel sad in a way I hadn't expected. This was my daughter we were talking about, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep and helped with scraped knees and cheered for at high school graduation. But then I reminded myself that the woman who'd stolen from me and threatened me with a nursing home wasn't that little girl anymore. She was a criminal who deserved to face the consequences of her choices. The investigation that followed was more thorough than anything I could have imagined. Within a week, FBI agents had executed search warrants on Brad's phone and computer, and what they found made my stolen car seem like the tip of an iceberg that went much deeper than I'd realized. Brad hadn't just been stealing from me, he'd been running a sophisticated identity theft operation that targeted elderly people all across Wyoming and Colorado. Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit called me 3 days after the search warrants were executed, and honey, what she told me made my head spin like a carnival ride. Mrs. Peterson, we found evidence that your son-in-law had been using your personal information to apply for credit cards and loans in the names of at least 6 other elderly victims. He had a whole filing system with copies of driver's licenses, social security cards, and other documents he'd somehow obtained from senior citizens in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. It turned out that Brad's job hunting trips had actually been visits to various care facilities around the region where he'd posed as a grandson or family friend and somehow gained access to personal documents belonging to vulnerable elderly residents. The garage that I'd been told not to look in wasn't just hiding the evidence of my stolen car, it was serving as the headquarters for a criminal enterprise that had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from elderly victims who didn't have family members willing or able to advocate for them. The trial, when it finally came 8 months later, was both satisfying and heartbreaking in ways I never expected. Sitting in that federal courthouse in Cheyenne, watching my daughter and son-in-law in orange jumpsuits being led in by federal marshals, I felt like I was watching the end of a story that had started with so much hope and promise but had gone wrong in ways that still seemed impossible to believe. Jennifer pled guilty to conspiracy to commit identity theft and elder abuse in exchange for testifying against Brad, who had apparently been the mastermind behind the whole operation. During her testimony, she broke down crying and apologized to me in front of the judge, the jury, and all the other victims' families who had come to watch justice being served. "I know what I did was wrong," she said through her tears, looking directly at me for the first time since the night I'd thrown them out of my house. "I know I hurt my mother and all these other people, and I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything, but I want everyone to know that I regret every single thing I did. My mother deserved better from me, and I failed her in every way a daughter can fail her mother." Y'all, hearing those words from Jennifer was like having a knife twisted in an old wound, because part of me wanted to forgive her right then and there, wanted to stand up and tell the judge that she'd learned her lesson and didn't need to go to prison. But another part of me, the part that had learned to stand up for myself and demand justice, knew that forgiveness without consequences wasn't really forgiveness at all. It was just enabling the same behavior that had gotten us all into this mess in the first place. Brad, on the other hand, showed no remorse whatsoever during his trial. He tried to claim that he was just a struggling working man who'd made some mistakes, and that the elderly victims were actually better off without access to their money because they might have been scammed by other criminals. Y'all, listening to him try to justify stealing from people in their 70s and 80s made my blood boil hotter than a Wyoming summer day, because he genuinely seemed to believe that he'd been doing us all a favor by robbing us blind. The federal prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez, presented evidence that painted a picture of Brad as a calculating predator who had specifically targeted elderly victims because he believed they would be less likely to report crimes or pursue prosecution. Phone records showed that he had researched nursing homes and senior centers online, looking for facilities with lax security and vulnerable residents who didn't receive regular visits from family members. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Attorney Martinez said during her closing argument, "the defendant didn't just steal money from these elderly victims. He stole their sense of security, their ability to trust, and in many cases, their will to live independently. Mrs. Peterson was fortunate that she had the knowledge and determination to fight back, but many of his other victims weren't so lucky. Some of them died believing that their own family members had abandoned them because they couldn't understand where their money had gone. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any I'd experienced in my 73 years on this earth. Brad was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $600,000 to all his victims. Jennifer received 3 years in federal prison and 5 years of supervised probation, during which she would be required to work with elderly advocacy groups to educate others about the warning signs of financial abuse. But honey, the real victory wasn't in seeing them punished. It was in what I discovered about myself during those months of fighting for justice. I learned that I was stronger, braver, and more capable than I'd ever imagined. I learned that age doesn't make you helpless unless you choose to be helpless, and that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who teach you the most about your own strength. The day after the sentencing, I drove to Miller's Used Cars on Grand Avenue, the lot where Brad had sold my Honda to a dealer who'd bought it in good faith, not knowing it was stolen. Mr. Miller, the owner, had been incredibly helpful during the investigation, providing all the paperwork and even testifying at the trial about how Brad had forged my signature on the title transfer. "Mrs. Peterson," Mr. Miller said when I walked into his office, "I've got some good news for you. The FBI has released your Honda back to you, and I've had my mechanics go through it completely to make sure everything in perfect working order. There's no charge for the inspection or the repairs we made, because what happened to you was just wrong, and I want to do whatever I can to make it right." Walking out to the lot and seeing my beautiful metallic blue Honda Civic sitting there in the Wyoming sunshine was like being reunited with an old friend who'd been missing for months. Y'all, I sat behind that steering wheel and cried tears of joy for 15 minutes straight. Not just because I had my car back, but because I had my independence back, my dignity back, and my sense of control over my own life back. That evening, I drove myself to the grocery store for the first time in almost a year. And honey, pushing that shopping cart through the aisles of Safeway and buying exactly what I wanted to eat for dinner felt like the most luxurious experience in the world. No one was going to complain about my choices. No one was going to eat my food without asking. And no one was going to make me feel guilty for spending my own money on things that made me happy. The legal proceedings had taken most of my energy for months, but now that they were over, I found myself with time and mental space to think about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. At 73, I could realistically expect to live another 15 or 20 years, and I was determined that those years were going to be lived on my own terms, surrounded by people who respected and valued me for who I was. I started going to a support group for victims of elder abuse that met every Thursday evening at the senior center. And y'all, listening to other people's stories made me realize how lucky I'd been to catch the theft when I did and to have the resources and knowledge to fight back. There was Margaret, 81 years old, whose nephew had stolen her entire life savings of $90,000 and left her unable to afford her prescription medications. There was Frank, 78, whose daughter had forged his signature to sell his house and then moved him into a nursing home against his will. But there were also success stories, people who had fought back and won, people who had rebuilt their lives and their finances after being victimized by family members or strangers. Listening to their experiences and sharing my own story became a source of strength and healing that I hadn't expected to find. And gradually, I began to feel like myself again instead of feeling like a victim who was defined by what had been done to her.
6 months after the trial ended, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to go back to school. Not to get another degree, because Lord knows I didn't need more education at my age, but to learn about advocacy and elder rights so I could help other people who found themselves in situations similar to what I'd experienced. The University of Wyoming offered a certificate program in gerontology and elder advocacy. And honey, at 74 years old, I found myself sitting in classrooms with students young enough to be my great-grandchildren, learning about legal protections for elderly people and how to navigate the complex systems that are supposed to protect vulnerable adults. My classmates were initially surprised to have someone my age in their program, but when I shared my story and explained why I was there, they embraced me like I was their honorary grandmother. Some of them were social workers who wanted to specialize in elder care. Others were preparing for careers in law enforcement or legal advocacy, and all of them were passionate about protecting elderly people from the kinds of crimes that had been committed against me. The professors were equally welcoming, and several of them asked me to speak to their classes about my experience as a victim who had successfully fought back. Y'all, standing in front of those young people and telling my story, watching their faces as they realized how easily this could happen to their own grandparents, was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I was turning my pain into purpose and my victimization into a tool for protecting others.
During my second semester in the program, I was approached by Detective Gonzalez, who had been promoted to lieutenant and was now heading up the elder abuse unit for the entire county. "Mrs. Peterson," she said over coffee at the Grounds for Coffee shop downtown, "we're starting a victim advocacy program, and we need someone with your experience and knowledge to help train our new officers and work directly with elderly victims. Would you be interested in a part-time position with the Sheriff's Department?" Honey, the idea of working in law enforcement at 74 years old was so far outside anything I'd ever imagined for myself that I laughed out loud when she first suggested it. But the more I thought about it, the more excited I became about the possibility of using my experience to help other people navigate the system that had seemed so overwhelming when I was going through it myself. What exactly would I be doing, I asked, because I wanted to make sure I understood what I was getting myself into before I committed to anything. "You'd be working with elderly victims from the moment they report crimes through the entire legal process," Lieutenant Gonzalez explained. "You'd help them understand their rights, assist them in gathering evidence, accompany them to court hearings if they want support, and basically serve as their advocate and guide through what can be a very confusing and intimidating process." Y'all, the more she described the position, the more it sounded like exactly what I wish I'd had when I was going through my own ordeal. Someone who understood what it felt like to be betrayed by family members. Someone who knew how overwhelming the legal system could be. Someone who could offer hope that justice was possible and that life could be good again after such a devastating betrayal. I accepted the position immediately, and within a month, I found myself with a badge, an office at the Sheriff's Department, and a caseload of elderly victims who needed exactly the kind of support and advocacy that I was uniquely qualified to provide. My first case was Eleanor Martinez, an 86-year-old widow whose grandson had stolen her Social Security checks for 6 months before she realized what was happening. "Mrs. Peterson," Eleanor said during our first meeting, her voice shaky with fear and embarrassment, "I feel so stupid for letting this happen. I trusted him because he's family, and now I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent or buy groceries." "Eleanor, honey," I said, taking her hands in mine the way I wish someone had done for me during those first terrifying days after I discovered the theft, "you're not stupid. You're a victim of a crime committed by someone who took advantage of your love and trust. That's not your fault. It's his fault, and we're going to make sure he faces the consequences for what he's done to you." Working with Eleanor and the other victims who came through our program reminded me every day why I'd chosen to turn my pain into purpose. Each case was different, but the emotions were always the same: shock, betrayal, fear, embarrassment, and eventually, with the right support and advocacy, determination to seek justice and rebuild their lives. 1 year after starting my position with the Sheriff's Department, I received a letter from Jennifer. She was 6 months into her prison sentence, and the letter was filled with apologies, regrets, and promises to make amends when she was released. Reading her words, honey, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because my daughter was sitting in a federal prison cell facing the consequences of choices that had destroyed our relationship and hurt so many innocent people. Relief because she finally seemed to understand the magnitude of what she'd done and was taking responsibility for her actions instead of making excuses. "Mom," she wrote, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not writing this letter to ask for it. I'm writing it because I want you to know that every day I think about what I did to you and to all those other elderly people, and every day I wish I could go back and make different choices. I know I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it somehow." The letter went on for 3 pages, describing the classes she was taking in prison, her work with a program that helped inmates prepare for re-entry into society, and her plans to dedicate her life to working with elderly advocacy groups when she was released. Y'all, reading those words from my daughter, seeing evidence that she was genuinely trying to change and grow from this experience, gave me hope that maybe someday we might be able to have some kind of relationship again. But that hope came with conditions that I made clear in my response letter. Any future relationship between us would have to be built on respect, honesty, and accountability. She would have to prove through her actions, not just her words, that she had truly changed and could be trusted to never hurt me or anyone else again. And she would have to accept that our relationship could never go back to what it had been before, because trust, once broken so completely, can be rebuilt, but never restored to its original state. Meanwhile, my work with the sheriff's department continued to be the most fulfilling career I'd ever had, even though I'd never expected to start a new career at 74 years old. In my first year, I worked with 43 elderly victims of financial abuse. And honey, seeing each of them find their strength and fight for justice was like watching flowers bloom in a garden that everyone thought was barren.
There was Harold Jenkins, 79, whose neighbor had been using his credit cards to buy expensive electronics and then selling them online. There was Dorothy Sullivan, 83, whose home health aide had been writing herself checks from Dorothy's checkbook for months. There was Robert Chin, 77, whose son had convinced him to sign over power of attorney and then sold his house without his knowledge or consent. Each case was heartbreaking in its own way, but each victim who found the courage to seek justice and rebuild their life was a victory that reminded me why this work was so important. Y'all, there's something powerful about being able to look someone in the eye and say, I know exactly what you're going through, because I've been there too. And I'm here to tell you that you can survive this and come out stronger on the other side. 2 years after Brad and Jennifer went to prison, I received a call that I'd been expecting, but still dreading. Brad was being released early for good behavior and cooperation with federal investigators in other elder abuse cases. Agent Chin from the FBI called to let me know that he would be on supervised probation for 5 years and was prohibited from having any contact with me or any of his other victims. Mrs. Peterson, I want you to know that he's being released to a halfway house in Denver, and part of his probation conditions include regular check-ins with a federal probation officer and participation in a program for offenders who've committed crimes against elderly victims, Agent Chen explained. If he violates any of the terms of his probation, including attempting to contact you, he'll be sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. Knowing that Brad was out of prison made me nervous for a few weeks, but gradually I realized that I wasn't the same frightened, vulnerable woman he'd victimized 3 years earlier. I was stronger now, more confident, and surrounded by a support system of colleagues, friends, and fellow advocates who would help me handle any situation that might arise. Plus, honey, I was wearing a badge now and working with law enforcement officers who took threats against elderly people very seriously. Jennifer's release came 6 months later, and unlike Brad, she did try to contact me. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, postmarked from Denver, where she was staying in a transitional housing program for women returning from federal prison. The envelope contained a single page with her new address and phone number, along with a brief note saying that she understood if I never wanted to see or speak to her again, but that she was available if I ever decided I was ready to have a conversation. I kept that letter for 2 weeks before deciding what to do with it. Part of me wanted to throw it away and pretend I'd never received it, because life was good now. And I didn't want to risk disrupting the peace and stability I'd worked so hard to rebuild. But another part of me, the part that had learned to face difficult situations head on instead of avoiding them, knew that I needed to at least acknowledge her attempt to reach out. I wrote back a single paragraph telling her that I was glad she was safe and out of prison, but that I wasn't ready for direct contact yet. I explained that she could send me updates on her progress through my sister Mildred, who had maintained limited contact with Jennifer throughout her incarceration, and that maybe someday in the future we might be able to have a conversation about rebuilding some kind of relationship. Y'all, that letter was one of the hardest things I'd ever written, because every word had to be chosen carefully to communicate both my ongoing hurt and my willingness to consider forgiveness if she proved through her actions that she had truly changed. It wasn't closure,
but it was a door left slightly open, and that felt like the right balance between protecting myself and acknowledging that she was still my daughter, despite everything that had happened between us. My 76th birthday came and went with a celebration that would have seemed impossible to me 3 years earlier. The sheriff's department threw me a surprise party in the conference room, complete with cake from the local bakery and a plaque recognizing my service to elderly victims in our county. Lieutenant Gonzalez gave a speech about how my advocacy work had helped change the way law enforcement officers approach elder abuse cases. And honey, sitting there surrounded by colleagues who respected my knowledge and valued my contributions, I felt more appreciated and useful than I had in years. That evening, I drove home to my quiet house, the same house where I'd been victimized and threatened and made to feel invisible. But now it felt like a sanctuary of peace and independence. My Honda Civic sat in the garage next to the red Monster convertible I'd bought with some of my restitution money. Both cars representing my freedom to go wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted, without asking anyone's permission or worrying about someone stealing my transportation while I slept. I'd also made some changes to the house that reflected my new sense of confidence and self-determination. The sewing room that Brad had turned into his video game cave was now my home office, where I prepared victim advocacy materials and worked on my continuing education in elder law. The kitchen table, where I once felt like a guest in my own home, was now command central for my volunteer work with the senior center and my part-time position with the sheriff's department. Most importantly, the garage that Brad had told me not to look in was now a symbol of my refusal to be intimidated or excluded from any part of my own life. I'd installed new lighting and organized storage systems, and I spent time there every day, whether I was maintaining my cars or just standing in the doorway remembering how far I'd come since that terrible morning when I discovered my car was gone. 3 years and 2 months after the trial ended, I received the news I had been hoping for but hadn't dared to expect. The federal government had recovered enough assets from Brad's criminal enterprise to pay full restitution to all of his victims, plus interest and penalties. My check arrived on a Friday afternoon, and honey, holding that piece of paper for $47,000 felt like holding proof that justice really could be served and that good people really could win against those who tried to take advantage of them. But the best part of that week wasn't even the money. The best part came when I got a call from Margaret Patterson, one of the women from my support group whose nephew had stolen her life savings. "Ruth," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement, "I just wanted to let you know that I got my money back too, and my nephew is starting his prison sentence next month. None of this would have happened if you hadn't encouraged me to fight back and help me navigate the legal system."
Y'all, knowing that my own experience and advocacy had helped other elderly people seek justice and rebuild their lives was worth more than any amount of money the government could have given me. It meant that my pain had been transformed into purpose, that my victimization had become a tool for protecting others, and that the worst thing that had ever happened to me had ultimately led to some of the most meaningful work I'd ever done. As I sit here today, 4 years after that terrible morning when Brad told me not to look in the garage, I can honestly say that my life is better now than it was before I was victimized. Not because being robbed and betrayed by my own family was a good thing, but because fighting back taught me things about myself that I never would have learned otherwise. I discovered that I was braver than I'd known, stronger than I'd believed, and more capable of starting over than I'd ever imagined. The garage holds both of my cars now, clean and ready to take me wherever I want to go, but it also holds something more valuable than transportation. It holds the memory of my refusal to be intimidated, my determination to seek justice, and my commitment to helping other elderly people who find themselves in similar situations. Every time I look in there, I remember that I am not a victim anymore.
I am a survivor, an advocate, and a fighter who learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the catalyst for the best thing you ever do with your life. And honey, that's a lesson worth more than any car, any amount of money, or any family relationship that was built on disrespect and dishonesty. Sometimes when I'm backing out of that driveway in the morning, heading off to help another elderly victim find their voice and fight for their rights, I remember Brad's words from that terrible morning. "Don't look in the garage, Mom." Well, sweetie, not only did I look in the garage, I took it back, along with my dignity, my independence, and my refusal to ever again let anyone make me feel invisible or unimportant. And every day that I drive away from that garage in my own car, paid for with my own money, I'm proving that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting stronger, getting justice, and getting on with the beautiful life you deserve to live, no matter how old you are or how badly someone has hurt you.